Hello all you lovely cosmonauts, as always I am Cosmic, and today we're going to be previewing a squad-based tactics indie RPG, Torn Tales, which is in development currently by Chilled Mouse and Twistplay. Torn Tales revolves around a simple premise. A folklore writer wasn't doing particularly well and no one liked his stories and told him he couldn't write. He turned evil and decided that if no one would have his stories, then the stories that were already established, like those of Robin Hood, Snow White, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, would be destroyed and completely rewritten in a more dire sense. So essentially he took the books of those stories and decided to add his own little flair where everything would go wrong and they would ultimately die. Now the game places you in the role of those characters, Robin Hood, Snow White and Dr. Jekyll, and you must essentially complete the challenges and go through this world that the evil writer has created and fix what has been essentially broken. Now Torn Tales is a squad-based RPG and it works very simple from a real-time setting. So you go through, you click an enemy and your entire squad will attack. Now you control one member of the squad at any time and the others will use their abilities freely as they see fit. You have a number of abilities to choose from and upgrade in terms of progression. Now each character has several ways of progression, several abilities, and then on top of that you can customize those abilities however you see fit with skill points. And I have to say that I was relatively impressed with the character customization. There's fairly a good amount of customization in there. You can really attune the characters to the way you want them to play, to focus on how you want them to play, and each character has several different abilities that will change their playstyle. So Robin Hood has both ranged and melee abilities, and you can essentially customize and specialize in whichever you prefer. Now the game is currently in a late stage of beta, which to me does not bode well. The reason for this is that the game has several execution problems and several problems on top of that frankly make the game ultimately a bad game. Now why do I say this? Well, if you take a look at the core mechanics on paper should work really well. However, the way they are executed in this game makes it a little bit of a clusterfuck. Combat itself is essentially a click fest whereby you left click on the ground to make an attack move, or you right click on the ground away from the enemy to try and get yourselves out of there. There is no real-time pause like in most games of this type where you would have the ability to pause time, queue up orders and make the entire experience more tactical. You don't have that. So what it essentially is more like is a really hands-off brawler whereby you're going into engagements with multiple enemies with your three heroes and doing your best to stay alive, use as much abilities as possible until you or the enemy are dead. Now for me this poses a real problem in the sense that it is almost trying to be hack and slash, but it isn't quite there because it's very hands off. Other than your activated abilities, you never feel like you have much control of what's going on. On top of that, the enemy AI is dismal, especially boss fights. For example, one of the very early bosses is the Huntsman from the Snow White story, and you can essentially just kite him around the entire map without him having any ability to close that distance. So he's really heavily damaged up close. So if you have Dr. Jekyll, who is completely a melee character, he's going to die pretty simple because the Huntsman is very strong in melee combat. However, you can just use Snow White and Robin Hood to stand afar, keep moving back while they're auto-attacking, and essentially just kite him around until he drops dead. The combat overall just has a lack of finesse, it has a lack of control, it isn't executed well, the AI isn't executed well, and it just leaves the entire experience feeling messy and almost RNG-like, in the sense that while you are trying to use your abilities the way they are intended, it can just mean that a lot of your characters just die straight off because it's just so messy. There's no tactical depth to the combat. It is just about trying to use your abilities at the right time and praying and hoping that you don't get surrounded by a group of enemies and just drop to the floor. There's a couple couple of things that make indie games stand out. Now, because they don't have the budget of a AAA game, they have to do things a little differently and stand out in different ways. Now, one important way that a good indie game, especially an RPG, can stand out is in its art style. You have to really create a unique looking art style that is going to stand out. Yes, it's not going to be realistic, or anything like that, but it's got to stand out and look good. Torn Tales does not look good. Torn Tales looks like it's been thrown together in Unity, and the textures on the terrain look really bad, even on the highest settings. You don't have a unique art style. You have almost like a game that has been, like I say, created in Unity by anybody putting assets together, and that's what it looks like. It doesn't look good, it looks crap. It doesn't ooze any kind of authenticity, any uniqueness. It just looks very, very brown bread, and that in itself is fairly boring. It's ugly, it doesn't look good. The camera angles are a problem throughout. You can't zoom in particularly far, and when you do zoom in to the closest range that you can get, the character models don't look good, the textures on the terrain don't look good, and overall, the overall visuals of the game and the sound, they're just not up to the quality that I would expect even from an indie title. It's a shame really, because what you essentially have is a really good premise for a game, because who doesn't want to play Robin Hood, Snow White and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde together on a team facing down various foes from folklore? That's a great premise. It's a great idea. The voice acting of the game is okay sometimes, but it's not fantastic. But you do have a good core concept for a really good RPG. The problem is in that every area of Torn Tales thus far in terms of execution is just subpar, and what it creates is a game and experience that is ultimately subpar. It's not good. It feels very generic. It has no character. It has no life to it. The combat alone, especially when a game like this is so combat heavy, it's so focused on combat. It's not like something like Divinity Original Sin, where you're going to have dialogue choices and ways to get out of fighting. This is solely focused on combat. It's more like a dungeon crawler, and that in itself is problematic because the combat is not good and it is not executed well. So sadly, it looks like this may be one at the moment to miss unless some drastic changes happen, and considering that it's due out in fall of this year and it is currently in late beta, it is likely that it's not going to have the drastic changes needed to make this game any good. So that is my preview of Torn Tales. Thank you so much for watching and listening. As always, like, subscribe, let me know what your thoughts are in the comments section below, and I will see you next time.